back, folks, to another session in our study of the Old Testament book of Zechariah, Return to the Lord. We have come to the final chapters, chapter 9 to 14 in our study, and these chapters are composed of two messages. Each of these messages begins with the phrase, the burden of the word of the Lord. The first message is seen in chapter 9, verse 1, the burden of the word of the Lord, and continues to the end of chapter 11. And the second message, beginning with the burden of the word of the Lord, is seen in chapter 12, verse 1, to the end of chapter 14. Last session, we began to look at this first message, and we studied the chapter 9 of Zechariah, and we'll continue on with that message in chapters 10 to 11. Throughout its history, the nation of Israel has so easily embraced false shepherds or false messiahs. And many times they have also been under the rule of false shepherds, false leaders. This will culminate in the last days when they will make a false covenant with the Antichrist. Isaiah chapter 28, verse 15 refers to this as a covenant of death. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27 refers to this as well as a covenant that's made at the beginning of the time of Jacob's struggles, the tribulation, and in the midpoint, the Antichrist will break that covenant with Israel and turn viciously upon them. As mentioned in our lesson last session, chapter 9, chapters 9 to 10 have in mind the Greek Empire that would arise following the Persian rule, and many Jewish people would become Hellenized, and Greek culture would set in amongst many. Worship of Greek idols, Greek temples, gymnasiums eventually built in Jerusalem. In chapter 9, verse 17, just picking it up from last session, let's read on to chapter 10, verse 3, the first part of verse 3. We read, "For what comeliness and beauty will be theirs, grain will make the young men flourish, and new wine the virgins." This is a glimpse, of course, to the time of the millennium when Christ will be reigning on earth. And then chapter 10, verse 1, "Ask rain from the Lord at the time of the spring rain. The Lord who makes the storm clouds, and he will give them showers of rain, vegetation in the field to each man." And then it says, "For the teraphim speak iniquity, and the diviners see lying visions, and tell false dreams. They comfort in vain. Therefore the people wander like sheep. They are afflicted because there is no shepherd. My anger is kindled," that's the Lord's anger, "is kindled against the shepherds, and I will punish the male goats." We'll just stop there at this moment. And we see, first of all, by the millennial blessings, that blessing comes from the Lord alone. And really, within that is the challenge for Israel, for Judah, for us to seek the Lord alone. But Judah and Israel as a whole had been struggling with looking elsewhere. And throughout its history, and during the days of the prophets, Isaiah, for example, and Jeremiah, during the exile and often after times, they sought elsewhere instead. Now, it mentions the teraphim, and the teraphim were household idols, often with human form, and they were often used for divining, like the household gods that the Romans and the Greeks all had. I visited the Israel Museum in Jerusalem and have seen all sorts of exhibits of idols from various periods of Israel's history, and this is a very sad thing to see. The word diviners is used there in verse 2, and that refers to lying visions and false dreams. The diviners saw lying visions and they told false dreams. They comforted people in vain. They said peace when there was no peace. That should sound familiar to us. Both Israel and Judah wandered like sheep. There was no shepherd. Verse 2 says, therefore the people wander like sheep. They are afflicted because there is no shepherd. My anger is kindled against the shepherds, and I will punish the male goats. They wandered in like sheep. They wandered into exile. Zechariah was writing under God's Spirit during a time when a remnant had returned from Persia, from Babylon, but there were many still there, and that reminds us again of how Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, had laid siege to Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and the walls and taken many of them captive into Babylon and killed many as well. But they wandered into exile without their native kings, and these kings had aided them in idolatry, as well as the male goats, the wicked civil leaders who oppressed and persecuted the poor flock. We see that throughout that time, as well as on into the time of the Roman Empire and the time of the Gospels. How does this apply to us? I think we need to ask ourselves a question. What or who are we looking to for blessing? And we need to ask, how are false shepherds abusing the sheep today? And there are many of them. We need to also ask the question, what are the qualities of a true shepherd? And in the Gospels, John chapter 10, which speaks of Jesus as the true shepherd, speaks about some of these qualities and the credentials of Christ as the true shepherd. Well, chapter 10, verse 3, the last part of verse 3 and on to verse 12, speak about future blessing. And the symbolism changes from a flock to a majestic horse in battle. And we read in the last part of verse 3, for the Lord of hosts has visited his flock, the house of Judah, and will make them like his majestic horse in battle, like a majestic war horse in battle. And then it tells us, verse 4, for from them, from Judah, will come. And it lists 4 messianic titles of the Messiah who would come through the line, the tribe of Judah, through the house of David. The first messianic title mentioned there is the cornerstone. The Messiah, the cornerstone. In Daniel and in other parts, the scriptures refer to Messiah as a rock, as a stone, a large stone. And here it mentions a cornerstone, which was the keystone that was fit 2 walls together, and it stood for stability and strength. Messiah is also mentioned as the tent peg, or the main peg in a tent that held the valuables. That would be the main post in the middle of the tent where all the valuables and important things were hung on. And then it speaks of Messiah as the bow of battle and the great warrior, the warrior king Messiah. And then we also see here in verse 4, from them every ruler, all of them together. Now, this little phrase, every ruler, should be translated every oppressor. And I believe the meaning here is that the work of Messiah will remove every oppressor. The house of Judah, the Messiah, the cornerstone, the tent peg, the bow of battle, the great warrior king, would bring the house of Judah together to be like a mighty, invincible warrior, army of foot soldiers. Look at 5. Verse 5, they will be as mighty men treading down the enemy in the mire of the streets in battle. I'll read that again. They will be as mighty men treading down the enemy in the mire of the streets in battle. And they will fight, for the Lord will be with them, and the riders on horses will be put to shame. Now that's interesting. The comparison of Judah as foot soldiers, a mighty, invincible warrior of foot soldiers, versus the cavalry of the enemy. And it shows the great power of the Lord. It reminds me of Deuteronomy 17, where we read that Israel was not to be afraid when they encountered armies with chariots and horses and cavalry. They would be on foot, but the Lord would be fighting for them. They would be strong and victorious because the Lord will be with them, and he will be with them in a glorious way when he comes to set up his kingdom and delivers them physically and spiritually. Historically, we can look at this passage in 164 BC as the Maccabees, who were under the oppression of Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, who is an Old Testament type of Antichrist. They were under the oppression of his army. And he had taken over the temple and desecrated it. And there were many that followed him, became involved in idolatry, and were unfaithful to God and to the Word of God. But we see here in that historical event how Judas Maccabees, and a number of them were faithful to the Lord, and God empowered them to defeat Antiochus and to cleanse the temple and light the candle, the menorah in it again. But eschatologically speaking, this would point to the second advent and the defeat of the armies of Antichrist. The Lord will bring the house of Judah together with the house of Joseph and Ephraim. In verse 6, I will strengthen the house of Judah, and I will save the house of Joseph, and I will bring them back, because I have had compassion on them, and they will be as though I had not rejected them, for I am the Lord their God, and I will answer them. Ephraim will be like a mighty man, and their heart will be glad as if from wine. Indeed, their children will see it and be glad. Their heart will rejoice in the Lord. I will whistle for them to gather them together, and they will be as numerous as they were before. When I scatter them among the peoples, they will remember me in far countries, and they with their children will live and come back. I will bring them back from the land of Egypt and gather them from Assyria, and I will bring them into the land of Gilead and Lebanon, until no room can be found for them, and they will pass through the sea of distress, and he will strike the waves. That's the Lord will strike the waves in the sea, so that all the depths of the Nile will dry up, and the pride of Assyria will be brought down, and the scepter of Egypt will depart, and I will strengthen them in the Lord, and in his name they will walk, declares the Lord. There's so much marvelous background to those verses. We know that after Solomon's death, Rehoboam was king, and the nation split into 2 kingdoms, 10 kingdoms in the north and 2 kingdoms in the south, the kingdom of Israel or Ephraim in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. And there was this wedge formed, which is still there today. But the Lord is talking about a time when he will heal and bring them together. He will bring the divided people. He will heal that wound, and they will come together as one, and they will enjoy great victory. It talks about the Lord whistling for them to gather them together. For I have redeemed them, and they will be as numerous as they were before. After the Holocaust, the Jewish population has dropped quite significantly lower and has never regained that number prior to the Holocaust. But it's telling us that at the second advent and the millennial reign of Christ, that Israel will become so fruitful and increase, just like they increased back in the days of Egypt when Pharaoh was so worried at the growth of the people of Israel in number. And then there's that imagery brought back from the time when they were in Egypt in bondage, and God opened up the Red Sea and they passed through it. It says in verse 11, and they will pass through the sea of distress, and he, that's the Lord, will strike the waves in the sea, so that all the depths of the Nile will dry up, and the pride of Assyria will be brought down, and the scepter of Egypt will depart, and I will strengthen them in the Lord, and in his name they will walk, declares the Lord. Isn't that marvelous? Now, we want to move into chapter 11 as we conclude this session. And chapter 11 of Zechariah has in mind now the Roman Empire. That's the 4th metal in Daniel 2, or the 4th beast spoken of in Daniel, I believe that's 7. And the Greeks were defeated by the Romans. Now this chapter 11, prophesies and looks ahead to one of the darkest times of Israel's history, from the first advent of Jesus Christ to 70 AD, as well as the years that would follow, and also the period of the tribulation, or the time of Jacob's troubles, that awful tribulational time when Antichrist is ruling in this world. Israel was under the rule of the Roman Empire and their governors and kings that ruled over various regions. Later on, during Jesus' time, we see the Herodian dynasties, Herod the Great and then his sons, and the division of Herod's, quote, kingdom, which was under Caesar, and the awful situations that took place during that time. This is the setting in which Jesus, the Messiah King, the good and rightful shepherd, was born. And Israel was very fragmented religiously and politically. There were the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection, anything supernatural. The Pharisees were keepers of the law. The Herodians, they were a political party, very Hellenistic, and supporters of the Herodian dynasty. And the Zealots, they rebelled against Rome and refused to pay taxes, and they were zealous freedom fighters. They believed God was the only king. And then there were the Essenes, who were ascetics and a devout group. And then, of course, Roman governors and kings and civil leaders, etc. Now, verse 1 to 3 of chapter 11 begins with the devastation that Rome would cause as it came from the north under Titus. It says, "Open your doors, O Lebanon, that a fire may feed on your cedars. Wail, O Cypress, for the cedar has fallen, because the glorious trees have been destroyed. Wail, O oaks of Bashan, for the impenetrable forest has come down. There is a sound of the shepherd's wail, for their glory is ruined. There is a sound of the young lion's roar, for the pride of the Jordan is ruined." And Titus would come in with this massive army. Trees were cut down and the land was raped as this massive army needed wood for fuel, wood for tent pegs, wood for siege equipment that it was building. And in chapter 11, verse 4 to 14, Zechariah is called to pasture the doomed flock, the flock that was doomed to slaughter. There would be a great slaughter coming on Israel because of the disobedience and rebellion of Israel. And they would be under great Roman oppression, which culminated in 70 AD with that siege of Titus's on the city of Jerusalem. Zechariah's actions here in verse 4, he's told to pasture the flock, and they foreshadow the Messiah King, the shepherd who would come at the first advent. John 1:11 says he came, the shepherd king came to his own, but those who were his own did not receive him. And he did come and seek to pasture and feed his fragmented flock during his earthly ministry, but was rejected. Now verse 5 goes on, "Those who buy them slay them and go unpunished. And each of those who sell them says, 'Blessed be the Lord, for I've become rich, and their own shepherds have no pity on them.'" And so they're under this kind of leadership that's abusing them and using them and taking advantage of them to pad their pockets, so to speak. "For I will no longer," verse 6, "have pity on the inhabitants of the land, declares the Lord. But behold, I will cause the men to fall, each into another's power and into the power of his king. And they will strike the land, and I will not deliver them from their power." So I pastured, that's Zechariah, so I pastured the flock doomed to slaughter, hence the afflicted of the flock. And I took for myself 2 staffs, the one I called favor and the other I called union. So I pastured the flock. So there he has 2 staffs, one favor and one union. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then it says, "Then I annihilated the 3 shepherds in 1 month, for my soul was impatient with them, and their soul also was weary of me." The word annihilated means to cut off. The best meaning of this verse seems to be the offices of prophet, priest, and king, the civil leadership. And they were in ruins, and the shepherd is impatient. He's vexed. He's grieved. Zechariah was grieved. The Lord would be grieved when he came. And they are weary. Hebrew word there means abhorred with Zechariah, but more with God, with Messiah, King, with the true shepherd. We can look at the Gospels and we can see the attitude of many towards the true shepherd and King. In verse 9, we read this very sad statement, "I will not pasture you." What is happening there? It says, "I will not pasture you. What is to die, let it die, and what is to be annihilated, let it be annihilated, and let those who are left eat one another's flesh." So I took my staff, favor, and cut it in pieces to break my covenant, which I had made with all the people. So it was broken on that day, and thus the afflicted of the flock who were watching me realized that it was the word of the Lord. Verse 9 is talking about judgments. Keep in mind what happened on 70 AD. Verse 10, the breaking of the first staff favor, which speaks of God's favor on his people, and the breaking of that, and it talks about a covenant as well there. I will break my covenant, verse 10. What is that covenant? Well, it's the covenant with the nations to restrain them from decimating God's people. God would set aside his gracious protection and allow judgment to come upon them. And verse 11 says, so it was broken on that day, which day? At Jesus' first advent. Now remember, there's also eschatological prophecy in this of the future time when Antichrist would come. We'll see that more at the end. But the people were tired. They were weary, abhorred God. Sounds like Malachi. They become weary of God. And then in verse 12, we read to 13, of 30 pieces of shekels, or of silver, 30 shekels of silver. So I said to them, if it is good in your sight, give me my wages, Zechariah says to the people. And remembering this is foreshadowing Christ's first advent. But if not, never mind. So they weighed out. If it's good in your sight, give me my wages. What did they give? So they weighed out 30 shekels of silver as my wages. The price, not just of a slave, but a slave that had been gored by an animal. And we read then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, that magnificent price at which I was valued by. Sounds kind of sarcastic, doesn't it? 30 pieces of silver, the price of a gored slave, and throw it to the potter in the house of the Lord. Give it to the potter to make useless vessels out of. Throw it in the house of the Lord. That would be the second temple at the time of Zechariah. And of course, this foreshadows what happened when Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver and threw it into the temple. And this revealed their attitude towards Jesus. He was totally useless in their eyes. Now, verse 14 says, then I cut in pieces my second staff union to break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. Okay. With this act, Zechariah broke the second staff, which he was called union. And there's no unity without acceptance and submission to the Messianic Shepherd King, Messiah, Jesus. 70 AD was one of the darkest hours. What happened to the fragmented Jews who were fighting one another within the walls and starving to death, eating their own children, while the Romans were building siege ramps on the outside? It was horrible. Josephus, the historian, said that about 1.5 million perished. Luke 19, verse 41 to 48 speak about this time. God in his sovereignty and love used and will use various forces to judge Israel for their resistance to him and the rejection of their shepherd king. And Satan played and will play a secondary role in lashing out at God's flock. Acts tells us that God worked out his redemptive plan at that time in the first advent of Christ. Acts 2, verse 22 to 24. Talk about that time. I'll just maybe read it here. Acts 2, verse 22. Men of Israel, Listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs, which God performed through him in your midst, just as you yourselves know. This man, delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. But God raised him up again, putting an end to the agony of death, since it was impossible for him to be held in its power. The last three verses, Zechariah 11, verse 15 to 17, speak about a future time. The Lord said to me, that's to Zechariah, take again, in other words, once more, Zechariah, take again for yourself the equipment of a foolish shepherd. For behold, I am going to raise up a shepherd in the land who will not care for the perishing, not seek the scattered, not heal the broken, nor sustain the one standing, but rather he will devour the flesh of the fat sheep and tear off their hooves. So unlike the true shepherd, which we've talked about before, who cares for the perishing, seeks the scattered, heals the broken, or sustains the one standing, this one will not care. He will not seek. He will not heal. He will not sustain. But rather he will devour the flesh of the fat sheep and tear off their hooves. And this is speaking about a future time, in an awful time, the worst time of history, in which a false shepherd will arise, namely the man of lawlessness, the Antichrist. And he will at first seem to be a peacemaker. He will have made a covenant with Israel, but it's really a covenant of death. But he will break it in the middle and turn full force upon Israel and seek to devour them, to destroy them, to annihilate them. And it's that period that's going to lead up to the second advent of Jesus Christ. But verse 17 says, woe to the worthless shepherd. And this is not only a curse on all worthless shepherds, but on this worthless shepherd that's coming in the future, the Antichrist, who leaves the flock. A sword will be on his arm and on his right eye. That's the sword, a judgment of God, the sword of the Lord. His arm will be totally withered, and his right eye will be blinded. What an awful period that'll be, but also God's in control. And we see two marvelous things as we conclude. One is that we have a Savior. When everything seemed at Christ's first advent to be falling apart, it actually was God's predestined plan to provide salvation through his wonderful Son, the true shepherd and the true King and the true Savior, by his death on the cross and his resurrection on the third day. But also there's coming a time when he's going to come to judge, and he's going to judge all the enemies of Israel. He's going to also deliver Israel physically and spiritually, and all of the redeemed Israel and the redeemed from all ages will reign together on this earth and then for eternity. Join us as we look next session at chapter 12 to 14, the second burden of the word of the Lord.